On this episode of China Unscripted, Japan is facing an unprecedented threat from the Chinese Communist Party. So it has one simple request for the U.S. Give us nukes. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesha.
Joining us once again and live is our friend Grant Newsham, a former diplomat and Marine intelligence officer and author of the fantastic book, When China Attacks. Not if, when. Hi, Grant.
Hi there. Glad to be here.
Definitely. Well, I mean, before the podcast began, you dropped a huge bombshell on me that I'm still recovering from. But let's start with something, nice and light. Nuclear proliferation.
Mm-hmm.
So Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they just visited Tokyo in July. And they talked about, with their counterparts, extended deterrence. So what does that mean?
What it means, actually, when it comes to Japan is nuclear weapons. The Japanese want to make sure that the Americans have nuclear weapons that they are willing to fire at anybody that threatens Japan. And that's a little bit paradoxical because the Japanese supposedly are the world's most anti-nuclear weapons people there are. So it's one of those paradoxes of Japan. It's not too hard to understand if you get human nature.
I was going to say, they obviously have a very unique relationship with nuclear weapons. And while I could understand the military and defense side of things, kind of understanding that, maybe having U.S. nukes around might deter China, how do people in Japan feel about that? Grave of the Fireflies and all that.
Well, Japanese people, like most people, like to avoid thinking about unpleasantness. There's just an assumption that things will kind of work out and that somehow the Americans will take care of things if the Japanese themselves can't do it. And since the Japanese themselves can't do it, there has just been this assumption that's grown up over 60, 70 years that if there's any gaps in Japan's defense, that the Americans will take care of it. But nobody likes to talk about nuclear weapons. And if you if you ask Japanese people, should Japan have nuclear weapons, most of them would say, well, no, of course not. But when you see what Japanese leaders and officials get together and talk to the Americans, they're saying, you got them, don't you? And you use them. And even the former Prime Minister Abe, before he was shot, he was pretty clear that he wouldn't mind if the Americans even had nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. And he sort of hinted that he wouldn't mind if the Americans let them borrow them now and then. A little bit funny, but not too much.
Well, and so the idea of extended deterrence is that the U.S. would promise to use nukes to defend Japan, put nukes in Japan, store them there?
It's at a minimum. It's to, if necessary, use U.S. nuclear weapons to defend Japan. The question of where you actually put them is another question. And some would say that, look, if you're using nuclear weapons, you can fire them from a long way away. They don't have to be in Japan. But sometimes there's a political reason for having nuclear weapons on your territory. It shows that you're serious about using them. And I think that is part of the issue, that the Japanese just aren't just aren't convinced that the Americans are going to really use them if the time comes. The Americans have tried to reassure them repeatedly, but it doesn't quite work for some reason. And it's almost like some guy someone being asked, "Well, do you love me?" And goes, "Yeah, I swear I do." And really? Yeah, I do. I really. And you keep getting asked this over and over. And that's sort of what the Japanese are doing to the Americans because they're just not quite convinced. There isn't really yet, I don't think, a threat here on the Japanese part that, look, if we're not sure, we're going to build our own. I don't think it's at that point at all. But a few things happen and it could get there. But it does show just how worried the Japanese are about the Chinese threat. They wouldn't really have had this discussion 20 years ago.
Do you think they keep asking because they're worried about the CCP or because there's something the U.S. is doing or not doing that's not reassuring to them?
The Chinese have just scared the daylights out of the Japanese. They won't come out and say it so clearly, but they're worried. and they have known this for at least a decade. But in a Japanesey kind of way, you don't sort of start screaming about a problem, whereas we would. But the Japanese don't do it. But they know what the threat is, and when the Chinese say things like, "Well, we're going to carpet Japan from end to end with nuclear weapons if you do anything to help Taiwan," well, it's not like the Japanese don't hear it. It's not like the Japanese don't take them seriously. So that is, part of what is going on here.
I mean, is that a legitimate threat from China that they would completely nuke Japan if they helped in Taiwan? Because I would think that they would be afraid of some kind of response from the U.S. or even Japan like that. That seems like almost just such an extreme, ridiculous threat.
Well, it sounds ridiculous, but when you hear it, if you're Japanese, it does give you some concern, particularly given the history of all of this. And you just don't quite know. And for many Japanese, there's no great love for China, or the Chinese, put it that, Chinese communists at least. And I think the feeling is reciprocated. I remember this was probably 20 years ago. I was invited to dinner by a sort of a lady in China whose father was with the embassy. And I don't remember what they wanted. It was a visa or something. And during the conversation, this Chinese woman who was studying at a Japanese university, had lots of Japanese friends. She was talking about, and in the context of it, she was talking about her Japanese acquaintances, her friends, and she was referring to them in Japanese as, well, the oni. And I hadn't heard the word. But she kept talking about oni this, oni that, as referring to the Japanese, obviously. And I thought it was like a term of endearment. And I went back and checked, and it's actually a word for the red ogre, or a demon. And she was throwing it out like you might have heard in West Texas in 1950, talking about some racial minorities. And it was just a matter of course. And that told me something about this fundamental attitude towards the Japanese. And, one thing leads to another. And the threat to nuke Japan is not far-fetched. And I think the Japanese are concerned about that.
If anyone's a red demon, it's the dirty Reds, the communists. Just a factual statement I'm putting out there. So I'm curious about this. Is there, maybe from the CCP's perspective, what is the difference between the U.S. having its nuclear weapons in Japan versus Japan developing its own nuclear weapons?
Oh, I think there's some sense that, well, if the Americans have them, it's better than the Japanese having them. And if the Japanese don't have them, they are by definition dependent on the United States to have somebody use nuclear weapons on their behalf. It makes the likelihood that they are used somewhat less, at least that the Japanese will use it. Then it could be the Chinese think they can intimidate the Americans or somehow get the Americans to back off. But this really is at the heart of Japan's concern, is that they're not convinced. But this is that the Americans are really as solid allies as they think they are. And this has been going on forever, and not just in the context of nuclear weapons. The Japanese they used to complain about, for example, the Americans dragging them into George Bush's wars. And then they would talk about fears that the Americans would pass Japan. It was called Japan passing. And that meant that the Americans might cut a deal with the Chinese because they're not interested in little Japan anymore. So they fret about that. Whenever a new president comes, they always wonder, well, what's he going to be like? And they do try to figure out how they can keep the Americans on the hook to defend them. It is it's not surprising when you have this sort of dependency on somebody. You're just not quite sure that they will do what they say they will, especially if, for example, it causes them more harm than they would otherwise experience. They could imagine America just standing back, Wall Street and the business class telling an administration, look, Japan, it's just not worth it. Thermonuclear war to defend Japan, not worth it. And so the Japanese have it's a fundamental doubt, and it's not surprising. And there's almost nothing the Americans can do to convince them. So in some respects, the Japanese are trying to get that locked in, but also trying to hedge their bets if they can. But they don't have the strongest hand to play on this.
The U.S. needs to put a ring on it to make Japan feel secure.
Doesn't the U.S. have a ring on it?
I guess that ring needs to be made out of uranium or something.
Yeah.
I mean, does the defense treaty we have with Japan, that's not
Enough?
Not really. I think until we actually shoot one, I'm not sure the Japanese would be convinced. And actually, the defense treaty, if you read the text of it, all it requires is that if something happens, that the Americans and the Japanese will consult and then follow their constitutional procedures. It doesn't say, at D+2, the Seventh Fleet will sail forth and vanquish Japan's enemies. It just says consult and follow constitutional procedures. But as a practical matter, the Japanese are expecting America to come help them.
But that would mean in the U.S., like, we would need to get congressional approval for any kind of, if it's going to be a war.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be,
It could take a while, but a president can also order, as the commander-in-chief, he could order
for a certain
things to
amount
move
of time.
right away.
Right. So is this the case with just the U.S.-Japan defense treaty, or is this the case in general with treaties the U.S. has with its allies? It's
Like the
sworn
Philippines.
to defend.
They're basic in Asia. They're basic. It's similar. We will have it. An obligation to consult.
Okay.
But the intent of the treaty is that we will get involved.
Right.
But the way it's written in diplomatic terms to give some flexibility. But if you read all of the treaties we have with the countries in Asia, the Philippines, Australia, even Thailand, Korea, you read it and you think, that's all? But there isn't an understanding that America will live up to its obligations. And the Japanese have it, but they just haven't been, they're just not convinced. And, one might say, well, you could improve your own defense. Even without nuclear weapons, there's a lot more you could have done. But, I would say that there's been 50, 60 years at least of what I would call pathologic dependence on the part of the Japanese on the Americans, which has meant that, you have the inevitable frictions that come out of that kind of relationship. One side says, well, you don't appreciate me. And the other says, well, you're too demanding. And the other one says, well, you're keeping me from being self-actualized and it leads to friction. And so some more balance in the relationship is a good thing. We are finally getting more than we once had. But this dependence has not been healthy. It's also meant that the Japanese military has developed in a way that is stunted, really. It's not a proper military able to fight effectively.
So not enough Gundams is what you're saying.
Not enough of them.
They have more than the U.S.
They got to start cranking those out at industrial, sort of cyclic rate.
Well, there are limitations based on the World War II Constitution the U.S. kind of forced on them about like what they can actually do, right? Like they can't have a military technically.
Well, you're right. If you read the language of the treaty, it's almost as if Japan would not be allowed to have a police force, much less even have knives and forks. I mean, that's about how straight the wording is.
Well, they don't really have knives and forks.
No, that's true.
Not at the dinner table.
Then you'd have
at
to
least.
have blunt-edged chopsticks. Then it's really very clear. And it's understandable when you look at what things were like when the treaty was written or the Constitution was written.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody had gone through this, god-awful war, and nobody wanted this to happen again.
And we got a new god-awful war on the horizon. We got
It's
to get ready
coming.
for
This one will be even better.
when China attacks.
Yeah. Well, they're attacking now, but the Japanese, they reinterpreted the Constitution very shortly after it was implemented, at the encouragement of the Americans who wanted their help in the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
And the Constitution has been reinterpreted repeatedly over the years, and Japan will do anything that it wants if it thinks it has to, regardless of the Constitution. You can always get the legal interpretations to follow along, and that's something to always remember, is Japan will do what it thinks it must do. But Japanese officials and diplomats, they use the Constitution the way you would use a Monopoly get-out-of-jail-free card. It's an excuse not to do anything they don't want to do. And it works like a charm on American diplomats. They'll say, look, we need you to do this. And the Japanese will almost stick out their tongue and go, Kempo, which means Constitution. Well, can't do it. We'd love to help you, but Constitution. And Americans go, oh, yeah, you're right. Instead of saying, but, you've got this military. It's a pretty big military. It's 250,000 people. It's
self-defense force.
That's right. And the Japanese used to insist, well, this is just self-defense. It's not really a military. And but it works, those excuses. And you'll hear the Americans making the excuses on Japan's behalf. I've heard this many times when people talk about getting Japan to do such and such. The American side will start saying, well, Constitution. And then they'll say, well, they're pacifists. It's a pacifist country. They just can't do it. So the Americans will make the excuses for the Japanese. I've seen this happen. And as a result, you have a Japanese military which is not nearly as capable as it should be. And it's not as capable of operating with the Americans as it ought to be. And this would come as a great surprise to the Japanese public, who think that things are in hand. And I've even told Japanese politicians this. Look, you guys can't fight. And they're just horrified. And I think they're probably thinking, when will the pitchforks and, the mobs with pitchforks and torches come to our place? But that is the reality of it, unfortunately. And this isn't something one can say if you want to get invited to anything. Because you've heard over the decades, American officials, after they have every meeting with the Japanese, they will say, relationship has never been stronger, never been better. And then there's other people who are saying, well, and even the Japanese in the military, some of them will tell you, look, couldn't somebody just point out that it isn't that good? But this is why we are where we are today. This is, where you've got China breathing down everybody's necks and threatening to use nuclear weapons, just breathing threatenings and slaughter. And unfortunately, instead of the Americans and the Japanese being as tied to the hip as they should be and able to operate effectively, and there's an exception, that's the two navies who actually are pretty good and know what they're doing. The Japanese Navy is about half the size it needs to be, but nonetheless, they have an excellent relationship. Not just that they're friends, it's that they can operate together. And it's also why this nuclear weapons issue is keeps getting raised. It's because the Japanese don't feel confident enough in the Americans, which I think is also ultimately a function of them not feeling confident in their own capabilities, which they have not developed as they should.
So why are they using the Constitution as an excuse? Like, what are the things they don't want to do that they're kind of saying, well, we can't?
Well, for many years it was they didn't want to spend more money on defense. They didn't want to build an amphibious capability. They didn't want to let the Japan Self-Defense Force, go overseas to train and operate with people. They limited what they could do with the Americans. And where they could do it as well. So the U.S. forces ultimately have to go out of Japan to train to defend Japan, if you can figure that out, because they don't have access to the proper training areas. And that is sort of the reality, but the reasons, the fundamental reason, there is the historic experience, because in 1945, every Japanese city of any consequence was in ashes. And this was before the nuclear bombs got dropped. It was just, Eve wasn't even icing on the cake. It was sort of just rearranging some rubble ultimately. And after the war, you could actually starve to death in Japan. That's how bad things were, whereas we had victory parades and, the veterans went off to college on the GI Bill. In Japan, it was just misery. So no one wanted to do that. But also, you had the Americans around to defend them, and it was the Japanese who asked the Americans to sign that treaty, the defense treaty. It wasn't the Americans that forced it on anyone. The Japanese kind of begged to have the Americans do it. But then you find that if you have somebody else underwriting your defense, you don't have to spend as much money on defense. You can spend that money on other things like a national health system, supporting your industries. And generally, defense is not a vote getter in most countries. And as I said, also builds up this comfort and this just sort of you're happy with the system as it is, and a dependency. It's no one likes to call it that, but that's what it is. And it was ultimately an unhealthy dependency. And the Americans were glad to go along with it for any length of time. And then when they say maybe the last 15 years or so, when it became obvious something needed done, that the Americans never really pushed the Japanese to do what they needed to do. Of course, they will say, they will tell you, "Oh, Newsham, you don't know what you're talking about," which is usually true, but they'll say it, and they'll say, "Well, we tried. We always asked them. We told them that we wanted them to do this," and they would hear it, go, "Yeah, okay." And what are you gonna make us do it? And no, yes, you can tell them. So the Japanese were never as frightened of us as they were of their own Ministry of Finance or of their own Asahi Shimbun, which is their equivalent of the New York Times, but really anti-military. And so we never pushed it. And we had been given in around 1970 the best advice American has ever been given about dealing with Japan. Was given ultimately by the then prime minister, a fellow named Tanaka Kakue of the Lockheed scandal fame. But the Americans wanted to put an aircraft carrier into Yokosuka, the naval base near Tokyo. They wanted to permanently assign it. And the Americans were hemming and hawing, and State Department and the embassy were saying, well, the timing just wasn't right. It would be too hard for the Japanese to do it. And nothing was happening. And then the short version of it is word came from the Japanese side, and it was from Tanaka, but his advisors had helped him figure this out. And the advice to the Americans was, tell us what you want, tell us what you need, and don't back down. And the Americans never do. We've ignored that advice, except for that one case of the getting USS Midway into Yokosuka. And I don't know what it is, but we don't want to be overbearing. We're afraid the Japanese will get angry, whatever it is. And instead we just sort of do nothing. And here we have a Japanese military that is nowhere near able to fight the way it should, nor able to fight with us.
And this is interesting because this is a story I've been hearing a lot over the years, like how NATO countries completely depended on the U.S. for security, and they got to put their spending elsewhere. We recently had a guest on who said essentially Taiwan is in the same situation as well, where they're not developing their military like they should because they're relying on the U.S. Japan's doing the same. This sounds like it's not going to work.
It's really late in the day. The Japanese are doing more than they ever have defense-wise. They've announced they're going to double defense spending. That was before the yen collapsed, of course. And they've said they're going to improve their military, buy long-range missiles, do more training with the Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't quite know what to do, what to spend it on. How do you build up a military so it can fight? This is a very specific sort of skill set and knowledge that you need, and it's not like you just sit down and figure it out. And so what's the solution? Well, have the Americans tell them.
Well, I believe I have a solution, as I've said. Gundams.
Well, if you can find them. I think they're
nukes are better, easier.
Well, speaking of nukes, so Japan is mostly powered by nuclear power, right? Because it's small set of islands. They don't have a lot of natural resources for power generation. They have over a dozen active nuclear power plants, right? Which means they also have refined uranium, and that same U-235 uranium can also theoretically be used for bombs. So why can't Japan just make its own nukes? It shouldn't be that hard, right?
It shouldn't be. I actually asked a friend who knows these things and who's not a history major. And he said, for a basic bomb, that would be no sweat. For like a hydrogen bomb, a little sweat. And he said something beyond that They'd have to work a little bit, but it wouldn't be hard. They could probably have one in short order. And I've heard any estimates from 6 weeks to 6 months. In terms of delivery systems, Japan's sort of rocket capabilities developed through their space program are excellent. They could figure it out if they wanted, but just having a nuclear weapon doesn't guarantee protection. Certainly if you're a democracy or a consensual government, it would also cause some immense problems in the relationship with the Americans if Japan did get that. So I say it's not quite the silver bullet that people imagine that it is. And really for a democracy, you really need a strong conventional capability along with, if you're going to have nuclear weapons. And it can either be your own or somebody who's got them and you're pretty sure they will use them. But without that conventional capability, you could find yourself in extremis so quickly. You're just getting defeated, on every front, that you feel I've got no choice but to use nuclear weapons. So actually, without the conventional part, you find that you may have some trouble. You're going to use nuclear weapons, and even then it's, if the other side's got 100 for every one you have, they might say, well, go ahead and see what happens.
So the nukes that are fast to build are like the old school ones, like the ones that we had dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Where they just explode a critical mass of U-235 together, and like really simple, right? That's a 6-week one, you said.
Oh, that's basically, as I understand it. But I think the Japanese are pretty clever. And I think they could probably put a good one, like a better one together quick enough. And I do.
So that's the Toyota model, but there's like the Lexus, if you want like the Lexus of nuclear weapons, that's the.
They could do it. They're clever enough and pretty quickly. And you do sometimes the debate amongst the commentariat as well. Do they have something going on under the table anyway? I don't know. I don't know.
You really don't know?
I don't actually. It's if I did, I would tell you. Well,
no, you wouldn't.
Well, I would actually. I just can't keep a secret. But
that's a good quality in a Marine intelligence officer.
I got to tell somebody. You guys are as good as anyone.
Don't worry, nobody watches.
No, the thing is, I don't know. I'm not aware of it. I've never heard anything to suggest that they do.
Well,
but I'll bet they've thought about it.
Well, earlier you said that they will do anything they feel they need to. What would make Japan feel like they need to develop their own nuclear weapons?
I think just a complete breakdown in the U.S.-Japan relationship and the trust that they have in the Americans. And at the end of the day, for all the doubts, this is the best deal they've got, and Japan knows this. And to actually go, if a Japanese administration went forward and said, we're gonna build nukes, this would cause a lot of angst inside Japan, and I don't know that anyone has the political will to do this. You wonder if it will actually to get Japan to take its defense as seriously as it should, if that's going to take a missile into Tokyo, or say a Japanese ship getting sunk in the down in the southern islands, and the survivors gunned, shot up in the water. You wonder if it takes something like that. And it just might.
Do you think that Shinzo Abe, had he not been assassinated, would have moved in this direction?
I think he would have. And he wasn't prime minister anymore, but he was influential.
He was like the kingmaker, right?
He had a lot of influence. And what he said, was people listened. And he had a pretty good sense of what Japan needed defense-wise. And he was also motivated, and this doesn't get talked about much in the praise lauded on him after he left, is that he, I think, kind of resented the Americans, and Japan's reliance on them. He, I think, resented the Americans having imposed the Constitution on them. But he was smart enough not to say this too loudly. And he wanted Japan to be, I think, independent. He was willing to have American help, But I think part of the thing that motivated him was a desire to have Japan able to take care of itself, which I don't think it could actually at any reasonable cost. But that was part of his thinking. And he was saying things that would have just been thought just outrageous even 5 years earlier. And the thing is, when he was saying it, it wasn't like people were, just, alarmed by it all. There wasn't any huge reaction to it. But it doesn't mean it was going to happen. But he was saying things that nobody had heard.
Is that why you think he was assassinated?
There's Japanese who will tell you this, but I don't know. I don't know if there was more to it than what's been reported. That was a young Japanese fellow who was upset with a religious group that had basically taken his mother's money, and Abe was seen as associated with that, and that's why it happened. I just don't know, but there are Japanese who think that there was something to that. I don't know, and I just don't know.
Okay, so I have a question. You've been describing this relationship between Japan and the U.S. as kind of like this not super healthy mutual dependence relationship. But in a more mature relationship, both sides would be relatively independent and self-reliant, but able to cooperate, right? And we've shown we can cooperate, right, with the naval exercises, for example. But we're not really at that stage where we both can be like, okay, you're totally okay if necessary without each other, you're self-sufficient. Isn't it, though, healthy for the U.S. to have Japan be self-reliant and self-sustaining? And isn't it healthier for Japan as well?
No, I think it is. You want more balance in the relationship because that's where, and some of the contributions needn't be entirely equal, but they need to be more than they were, and or less imbalanced than they were. And once you get that balance in the relationship, that it tends to cause the frictions tend to sort of dissipate. And I think it's the same in nation-to-nation relations as it is in human relations.
We're all just people, right? Even the high-level diplomats.
No, those aren't people. Yes, they're even the high-level diplomats have a different sort of motivation, and I think it's to avoid controversy, is to maintain the status quo. But
that's not always the wisest move in a relationship.
Not really. And speaking of this need to balance the relationship, that part of this is and a huge chunk of it is the U.S.-Japan defense relationship. That's what properly gets a lot of the attention. And that, if you look back, say, early 2010s, that the relationship was so out of balance that you could see that China, we believe that, when I say we, me and another guy, a Marine major named Jeff Tenon, we said, look, this is so imbalanced that China can split the alliance by just sending their lobbyists, their white lobbyists, up to Capitol Hill, onto the talk shows and say, look, these Japanese think that you're going to die for them as they snap their fingers, and they're not going to make any sort of real contribution. And you could see that kind of resonating throughout the American public, because it was kind of true that Japan was cutting its defense spending every year. The military didn't even have a radio with which the three services could talk to each other. You have these three parts that can't even operate, and it was obviously counting on the Americans to defend them. So we thought you needed to put some more balance in that, and that's why we went about helping them create an amphibious force without telling U.S. Indo-PACOM. And the idea was, as I say, to give the Japanese the ability to fight on their own, to give them the confidence to know that they could fight, and also that tends to change the way the Americans looked at them, which was you take the Japanese more seriously. Because except for the navies, there was very much a sense that, well, Japan, you guys go sit in the corner, we'll take care of things. And that's not healthy. So you wanted the Japanese military to have more confidence. You wanted the Japanese political class to also say, yeah, we can take care of ourselves. We can do a lot more than we're doing. And you force the Americans to take the Japanese seriously. And that actually kind of worked out pretty well. It's an example of how you try to build that sort of a more equal relationship. And it has a political knock-on effect, and it strengthens the political relationship. And I think it's a much harder thing to split now from Beijing's perspective than it was. But it was essential. That's and that was the thinking. And the secret, of course, was don't ask permission if you want to get something done.
From Japan's perspective, how pressing is the China threat? Because there's the tensions in the East China Sea that are directly China-Japan. But do they see that it's more China-Taiwan, and then Japan would then be like a knock-on after that?
Oh, I think the Japanese are pretty clear that in their belief that China wants to pay them back, wants to teach them a lesson, and that's the word the Chinese use as well. It includes taking back territory, particularly the Japan's southern islands, the Ryukyus. Ultimately,
when you say taking back, is this one of those like reunification lies, like over Taiwan?
Very much.
Because at what point did the CCP have control over those islands that are now under Japanese administration?
Pretty close to never. They never have. And the argument, the legal case and the arguments, a fellow named Dr. Robert Eldridge has written about this at great length. And he comes out on the Japanese side. And the Chinese just don't have a claim to it at all, but they make it. And
they need another dashed line. Like all around Japan.
Well, I think that would be the 11th. I think the 10th kind of gets some of the Japanese territory in it. But they've said that they're going to take it. They quietly said it. And regarding the Senkaku Islands, the ones that are immediately in debate.
Do you mean the Diaoyu Islands?
Well, I never. But yes, those two. Even Taiwan says they belong to them. But they're under Japanese administration. But the Ryukyus, if you go farther up all the way to Kyushu, now China covets those, and the Japanese know this, and but as is their wont, they just don't say it all that loudly, how afraid they are. But they also do see Taiwan as part of Japan's defense, and that's an expression you used to hear a lot with Japanese military years ago, that Taiwan's defense is Japan's defense. And part of the point there is that the sea lanes through the South China Sea, through which at least 80% of Japan's oil comes, all go by Taiwan through the South China Sea. And they don't want to have those things choked off,
right.
Nor an enemy in a position where they can come up and surround Japan again. So they very much are very concerned about the Taiwan problem. They're actually, in practical sense, not doing anything to be very helpful militarily at all, but they're doing more with the Philippines, and that is all tied into this broader defense of Taiwan.
Yeah, recently the Philippines had a drill for the first time with Japan and also with the U.S. But from what you're saying, I don't know if these, like how much of a help would these militaries be to the U.S. in the event that we got to fight China?
You don't want to, ever sort of refuse any help.
Mm-hmm.
And the Japanese can be very helpful to us in certain niche areas. For example, their anti-submarine warfare is very good. Their submarine force is good. Maritime surveillance, even surface warfare is good. Missile defense is good. Their space operations are also good. But those are niche capabilities. And the Japanese Navy and Air Force are probably half the size they need to be for all the missions they have to carry out. In fact, the Japanese couldn't find enough crew for a couple new ships they wanted to build. So there was talk of sort of press ganging 500 Japanese army people and making them sailors and forcing them to man the ships. That's how bad it is. But in certain areas, they can be extremely useful to us. So, but it's a fraction of what this should be. The Philippines, down in their area, they have a certain usefulness. Each of these has a role to play. It's not as much as it should be, but you kind of are where we are. And the problem now is to make when it comes to the Japanese, make them better. And that just takes a little bit of effort, but it can be done, but it's going to take hard work. And it is late in the day. In baseball terms, it's probably the bottom of the seventh.
So that's the question. Is there time?
I don't know.
And China must be seeing there's never going to be a great time for war. But things have definitely turned around where more of the world, particularly the United States, is kind of against them. They must see that if Japan is increasing its military and increasing its training with the U.S. and Philippines, that eventually they're going to have to decide, well, maybe we shouldn't wait for things aren't going to get any better.
Mm-hmm. That is probably part of their thinking. Well, it has to be, and I think if not now, when? Because they've really got, I'd say, a window. Maybe say almost starting from September onwards for who knows 9 months or so, maybe even longer, and that is it must be very tempting, I think, on the Chinese side to think should we or shouldn't we? And so I don't know if we have enough time. So we should have started what we're doing to try and bolster our position, bolster our ties to the Japanese, and our military capabilities should have started at least 5 years ago. 10 years ago would have been better. But that's often the case. So that it's not, the outcome is hard to predict. But we should have done it much, much sooner.
Well, one of the challenges with that, and this is something you've written about, is the influence that China has had on decision makers in Japan. Can you talk, because elite capture is something that we've faced, of course, in the U.S., but what's the situation with Japan?
It's as bad there as it is here. And that's bad enough.
How bad is it?
I used to say as a rough, sort of half jokingly, but not really, that if you asked the Japanese citizenry what they thought of the PRC, you would get about an 85-90% negative reply. And that is what opinion polls have showed for a long, long time. If you ask that question in the Diet, which is their Congress, I always thought you might get about 40% replied like that. And to give you one example of how this has worked is that this was a while ago, probably 15, 20 years ago. A senior Japanese politician, a guy named Ozawa, he took a group of, it was a huge number of politicians. It was like 60, 70. I could be understating it. I just don't quite remember. He took them on a study tour to China, a study tour. And you can imagine what goes on there. The money, the girls, the blackmail. And they all came back thinking China's a great place. And it wasn't the only time that's happened. These sort of study tours are very common. And a lot of Japanese officials get invited over to China as well. And this is just one way of subverting and, getting this elite capture. And the business class in Japan is just as craven as ours when it comes, and saying in promoting just status quo with China, don't upset them, so we can keep trying to do business here.
What, are you saying Wall Street is craven?
Oh, it's that. Unless there's another Wall Street that I haven't heard of. But yeah, I would have to say. And our business class, what does one say? Look at those groups that go to China, and they sort of give toadying a bad name when you see the video of their meetings with Xi Jinping.
I'm thinking of I'm picturing Mark Zuckerberg, with his book on Xi Jinping thought on his desk.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, he's a different man now. He got a hair transplant or something. He's looking a little buff.
He's looking
What
buff.
does that have to do with how he feels about Xi Jinping?
Because once you get your hormones right, you'll naturally become anti-communist.
He did ask Xi Jinping to name his firstborn child.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Okay.
Allegedly.
Well, but I mean, there's people like Zuckerberg, there's people like Jeff Bezos who have massive business interest in maintaining deals with Chinese manufacturers and Chinese shipping, which is very cheap, right? And also he controls a bunch of other things like, food, like with Whole Foods, and media, like with the Washington Post. And so
Don't
I
worry, the
can see
Washington Post hates him.
yes, well, nonetheless, they're owned by him. So anyway, I mean, your point about elite capture, it's scary because it does trickle down into all these aspects of society, some of which are maybe not so obvious. But Japan, I mean, my understanding is that a lot of Japan's large businesses are controlled by a relatively small number of families, and there's historical reasons for that, right? There's a few like really big businesses, and the people who run them can all potentially be elite captured.
It's it's the family control is less than it was, except in some cases, but that's correct. And big business does see its interests as the China market, very much like ours has been. It's changing a little bit, just as ours is, where some people are sort of wising up. They're finding it's not as easy to get out as you think, though.
Or that after 2 decades of investing in China, your returns are at best zero.
Pretty close. And then whatever you want to take out of China, well, you're going to need permission from the State Administration of Foreign Exchange.
Yes.
It's not coming. And so Japan has a similar problem to that. And it really, it's over time, and they've had decades to make this happen. And it just gets hard to correct. And it's also a little easier, I think, for the Chinese to work on the Japanese, because the cultural closeness, even linguistically, it's a little easier to deal with each other. And it just makes it, and you're just closer. It's just a little easier, but I think both countries do have that problem. I was once showing a list of with Japanese officials in part of the government who were regarded as much too close to China for health. And there were names on there I recognized. And there were ones that, oh man, I had just met one of them a few days earlier, and he was of some prominence. But the point is that they've had a long time to work on it, and Japan has been sort of attacked on this non-kinetic front and for decades, and that affects their ability to deal with the Chinese as well. It's what really every nation faces, so they're no different in that regard. But they probably woke up, I think, to the China threat sooner than we did, certainly on the defense front. This may be 2012-ish or so. There was at a meeting somewhere in Hawaii, and there was a very senior U.S. Army officer there, and very senior. And he was there. He led the meeting, and the Japanese were there. Their most senior defense officials, military officials, Army officials were there. And they gave a presentation explaining the China threat. So that would be 12 years ago. And it was like what we'd be talking about today. And the American officer dismissed them just very rudely, actually. It was like, what do you, yeah, I hear you, yeah. It was to the point if a lieutenant had done it, you'd had to fire him. And I have, in the years, 30 plus years or so, I've been dealing with the Japanese. I've seen them really angry exactly twice. This was one of the times. And they were so angry, but you wouldn't have known it unless you knew what to look for. And at the break, I talked to them, and boy, they were steaming at how they had been treated and the way this guy had just dismissed their warnings of what was coming from the PRC. So, to Japan's credit, there have been people who've understood what's coming and tried to sound the alarm, but they were generally given about the same treatment people in America who tried to sound the alarm were given.
Do you know that guy who dismissed the warning? Is he still in a position of power?
He's retired now, but as such things go, you generally go from you keep getting promoted
you
up.
fail up.
Oh yeah, he failed up, and but oh my goodness, they were angry at him, and but it was obvious. And then there was an Australian general there at the meeting who he could obviously went along to get along, and he said, well, I'm going to extend the open hand of friendship to the Chinese, or however the Australians would say it.
Dummy.
I sound more like a guy from Alabama, but he sort of sided with the American. The Japanese, I'm surprised they didn't just combust on the spot. But I was embarrassed, and I was sitting actually they were lined up here, and I was looking down them. You could, if you've been around a while, when people are pretty cross, and they were not angry, but it was a lost opportunity. We've had time to get ready. We just decided we didn't want to.
Well, so going back to the beginning, are nukes the answer?
You'd better have them. If you don't, you will wish you had them. And you also, and I'm just talking about our nuclear arsenal. We've got a lot of them, but we don't seem to have anything. It's either all or nothing, in the sense we don't have so-called tactical nuclear weapons, or enough of them. And these are the little ones you want to shoot off when you just want to make a point with someone, as opposed to ending civilization. We can end civilization without much trouble, but these are the smaller ones. And if you don't have that, and your only option is to go all in, well, you just might not do it. And if the other side has an arsenal that has these little ones too, well, they're going to play that for all it's worth. And the people who are counting on us, well, they can do the math, and they understand the weaponry as well. And they say, well, you guys, you're not putting enough into, your weapons that you say you're going to use for us. So we got some doubts, and maybe we need to get our own. But once again, as noted, even if Japan got nuclear weapons, it's not necessarily, that's that. We're safe forever.
Yeah, you don't want your nuclear option to just be the nuclear option.
Pretty much, and I've never been all that interested in nuclear stuff, because it's distasteful. But and the way these people casually talk about throw weights and launching tactical nuclear weapons, just very casually, the way we might talk about shooting off 10 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. You do that and you kill a whole lot of people. So it's a tough business, but it needs to be taken seriously. And I don't know that we've done it. We've allowed that to lapse. That's for sure. Meanwhile, the Chinese are cranking out nuclear weapons, rapidly.
I mean, what's the real cost? What's the downside for the U.S. of keeping a few nuclear warheads stationed in Japan?
If there's a political requirement to do that. By political, I mean, if that's what it takes to give Japan the assurance that we are going to help them, not just with nuclear weapons, but with everything. And extended deterrence actually refers to everything. But as a practical matter, we're talking about nuclear weapons here. But if that's what it takes, and then maybe we should. And if it keeps there's an argument over whether Japan should have nuclear weapons or South Korea have them of their own. I've heard it argued both ways, and I wouldn't say I'm indifferent, or agnostic, but they're certainly respectable countries that might at some point think it's necessary to have them on their own, but without a conventional force to go with it, it's not a guarantee much of anything. And they may find that if it causes the Americans to be less likely to support you, that they could find themselves having some nuclear weapons to shoot, but then getting 100 back in return, or just having to use them right away. So it's a problem, it's an issue that's not going away. One does note that the American fixation on nuclear non-proliferation or disarmament or reducing nuclear weapons, it's been a game that we've been playing out there with really in Asia and elsewhere, but really in Asia for decades with only one side playing, and that's China and North Korea. And they're playing by their rules, and we've been trying to keep our guys, our side, without nuclear weapons, while the other side's been making them and threatening to use them and demonstrating that they can. And the other side is rightfully, I think, getting antsy about it and wondering, well, the Americans, what are they going to do? Are they really going to, risk LA for Tokyo? I don't it's I can understand the concern over this.
I would risk LA for Tokyo myself.
You're from LA.
Yes, that's why.
Yeah, I'd trade it. Yeah. San Diego, probably not, but LA, I think.
Well, Grant, you mentioned that Japan, at least from the military side, seems to have woken up to the China threat sooner than the U.S. has. What about the political warfare front? Like, are they doing something about the elite capture? Is that turning around?
I don't think it is. I don't think China understands, I don't think Japan understands political warfare at all. And they have pretty much been a sort of an open target for the Chinese. And I mentioned, the number of politicians who sort of think China's okay.
Or there's, blackmail videos of them with Chinese women on their trips.
Oh, that's
Right.
part of the game, and and it's ongoing. It wasn't like it was done once. So I don't think Japan understands the political warfare front very well. I don't think they have any scheme to deal with it. One might ask if we do it any better. I don't know about that. But so you could get the military part right. You could build that up. But if you have, been subverted and lost on the political warfare front, the economic warfare, the dependencies, the drug warfare isn't such a problem in Japan. But they have also been working successfully on your biggest supporter, your biggest ally, America, that you could build up the Japan Self-Defense Force, make it a coherent, sort of tough outfit, and you'd still lose. But if you don't pay attention to the political warfare end of all of this, you're in big trouble. And that applies to us as much as it does the Japanese.
Doesn't matter if you have nukes if you don't have any political will.
Oh, yeah, you could maybe just hand them over when you lose, if that's the case. The nuclear weapon, to say, is not the fail-safe that people often think it is. But if you don't have them, especially if you're a democracy, that you'll wish you did.
Well, thank you very much for joining us in person, Grant.
No, pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to come.
And once again, the book is When China Attacks. I'll leave a link for that below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And we'll talk to you next time.